Welcome, I'm Bill Brewster and this is Drywall Techniques. Today's segment is Series 10, Sheetrock Overlay over Asbestos Ceilings. You need to remember when you're dealing with asbestos ceilings, or asbestos in general, it's extremely dangerous. It's very expensive to have it removed from buildings, piping, ceilings, floors. Anything older than, I would say, 1970, there are homes with asbestos ceiling tiles, floor tiles, and even the acoustic spray that you have, or popcorn as they call it, and on some homes, is asbestos based. So it's always good to take a small sample and have it checked to see if it's an asbestos product. And if so, last thing you want to do is to generate any dust with that stuff. So dealing with our asbestos ceiling, we've decided to prime the ceiling thoroughly, making sure that it's completely covered into the corners, there's no cracks. The primer will have a tendency to seal it thoroughly, so we can glue and screw the sheetrock to the acoustic ceiling. So what we'll do first is we'll go through and mark our wall where the ceiling studs are, all the way across, which we have a reference point where we're going to be screwing to the lid. Well, we've just cut our sheetrock to size, and now we're ready to put the construction adhesive on. At this point, you want to make sure you put a liberal amount on. Remember, when using your construction adhesive, make sure you put plenty on the back of your sheetrock. That way, when you install it and it's screwed on, the glue is bonded to the existing ceiling. It's good to remember while working with asbestos, always make sure you wear proper eye protection and a respirator or a mask or something. In some cases, they wear a full body suit with air tank to protect themselves. So that's basically for more full demolition. But at this point, with the ceiling sealed with primer, everything is sealed tight, there's no dust, asbestos dust floating around, I'm still going to use my mask while I'm screwing off the ceiling. So at this point, we're going to start screwing off the lid. So what we've done at this point is we've hung this sheet of sheetrock on the lid by screwing off the perimeter of the board. Now it's time to screw off the field. We'll be using a screw gun and a 2-inch screw. As you remember, before we started hanging the sheetrock, we made marks on the wall as reference points, so when we installed our sheetrock, we knew exactly where our ceiling trusses were. So right now we're going to be making a mark across the sheetrock, so that way when we're screwing off the ceiling, we don't miss a stud and end up having to pull the screw out. So there's two different ways of doing this. You can either use a straight edge and use a pencil and make a light mark all the way across the board. That way you know exactly where to screw without missing. But if you use that method and you're going smooth wall, that indentation, light indentation with a pencil could show up over your smooth wall. I prefer using a chalk line. So all you have to do is hook it where the stud's at, and pull it across, keeping it all in line. Snap the line. Give you a nice defined line, that way you know where to screw to without taking a chance of missing. We glued the sheetrock before installing it and screwed off the perimeter. I would still recommend putting 4 screws in the field. Now that our sheetrock's installed, we're ready to pre-fill. We're using 45-minute hot mud for our pre-fill. The hot mud comes in powdered form. Just add water and mix to your desired consistency. We like to have it a little on the thicker side so it doesn't have a tendency to ooze out, especially doing the ceilings. Now you're ready to pre-fill. Major size gaps in the sheetrock, or fractures, or we call them blowouts, where the board actually fractured, is broken. Those all have to be dug out and pre-filled. So at this point, take the mud, press it in to the ankle. As you can see, getting over into this corner, there's a major fracture and gap. may take a few times to press enough material into that angle. Just press it in and wipe it out. Any loose paper, tear that out as well. This will set up probably in about 20 to 30 minutes. At that point, we'll come back, take our knife, scrape this flat before we start taping the angle. At this point, our hot mud's dry, so we're going to start scraping it back. Make sure you get enough shaved back so you don't have any kind of a lump right here. Make sure it's all totally flat. As you can see, we have about 3/8 of an inch pre-fill at this point. This should be sufficient for just angle taping. But over here, we have about 1 inch. So what we'll do here is first flat tape it, and then we will angle tape this. Always remember, before taping angles, you always tape your flats first. So basically what we'll be doing is flat taping the pre-fill to about here. And then we'll angle tape the rest of the way. So get some mud behind the tape. Push it into the angle. And just wipe it out. Make sure you don't wipe it out too much. You don't want to wipe all the mud out from underneath the tape. Now at this point, flat taping is done. Now we'll angle tape the rest. Make sure you have your mud nice and thin. You do not want to have thick mud at this point. Make sure there's no skips. Make sure there's mud through all along here. If you have a small pocket of air underneath the tape, we call those blisters, and And then when you go to priming or painting that area, it'll blister out, cause a bubble, and it'd be a real problem for you to fix at that point. So what we're doing first is we're creasing our tape. Take it and pull it and crease it, and then insert it into an angle. Start off in the middle of the tape and pull to the left and then to the right. If you started here and work this way, the tape will have a tendency to ball up in the center and wrinkle. So by starting in the center and pulling this way, then this way, it stretches the tape out and keeps it from wrinkling. Make sure there's no buildup of hot mud on the wall side either. That will cause a lump in your angle. You want to have a nice, sharp, crisp angle. You don't want to have any buildup. You don't want it sunken in. You don't want to have a round angle. Okay. Now we're ready to insert the tape into this angle. Crease out your angle. Crease out your paper, I should say, first, by holding the paper like this and then pulling it. Pre-creasing. And then insert it into the angle. You can use your knife to adjust it, sliding it back and forth before you wipe it in. Start off close to the middle and work your way this way, then the opposite direction. If you go into a spot where the 6-inch knife doesn't fit very well, you can either tilt your knife sideways, which will help accommodate your knife, or just simply switch to a smaller knife. This coat's extremely important to keep it as clean as possible. Make sure this corner is as sharp as possible. Just remember, every coat you put on, the cleaner this coat, the easier the next coat will be. Now that the flats are taped and the angles are taped, we're now ready to put the first coat on the screws. There's a little trick that most of us drywall tapers know, and instead of going through and touching each one and spotting these screws one by one, which is kind of a tedious, time-consuming little project, it's much simpler just to put some mud in your knife, such as this, and then run your knife across the ceiling or on the wall, like that. One swoop. At this point you can see your screws. Make sure that you can't see the screw head at all through the mud. If you can, you have to take a screwdriver to it, screw it a little farther, or readjust your screw gun to make sure that it sinks a little better, because that could end up being a problem. So make sure all those little imperfections and the screws are sunken deep enough. And this coat will have to dry, and it's called the tape coat. And then tomorrow we will put our first coat on over the tape. Now at this point our tape coat is dry. Now we're ready to put our first fill coat on over the tape. I always like coating my flats first. As you can see, the bare tape, how much fill this flat will take. And being that this flat is so close to an angle, I'll coat this angle the same time I coat the flat up. Just fold up the ceiling into the angle, clean your angle out. Look at your edge right here. Take some nice long even strokes. Feather your edge. And then check it. Allow this to dry. Remember, make sure you feather your edges. Always pull into the existing mud. Never make a heavy start, such as this. You always pull into it to have stop. which is a little bit of a lap mark. Remember, the cleaner you use this coat, the easier and cleaner the next coat will turn out. The last flat we coated out had 2 factory recessed edges, so all we had to do was coat right down the center. But this one is a butt joint, and it's 2 non-factory edges together. So we're going to have to split them out a little farther to be able to hide the joint. I'm going to be splitting it out at least 2.5 times wide. There's a knife. Feather your edges. Make sure you have all the little skips filled in, little hollow areas filled in. You apply pressure to feather this butt joint by feathering it this way, killing that edge, and then as you go across, lessen the pressure so it doesn't dig in on one side. Don't be concerned about these 2 lap marks right here, because when this dries, we'll be able to come back and sand it down and put additional coats on. I'll be using a 6-inch knife. Put a nice even full coat on. Feather it to the edge. Lightly take out any extra mud that was left behind. And pull into the butt joint. Now at this point, whenever possible, alternate and coming into a corner. Since we've at this upper angle, now we will coat this bottom part this way. Then when this dries, we'll sand everything out, and then we coat the angles tomorrow, we'll do the opposite sides. And now last but not least, we have a few screws to spot. So like last time, we ended up just taking our 6-inch knife with a mud on it and just going along the screws. Very easy to do. The first fill coat basically is the heaviest coat. It could take a day or two to dry thoroughly. It's a good idea to make sure it dries thoroughly. You don't want to have problems with delayed shrinkage later down the road after the job's even primed. So tomorrow, providing the first fill coat is dry, we'll be putting the second fill coat on, which should dry a lot better, and then the final skim coat and final sand for our smooth wall project. So at this point, we'll let this dry and then hit it again tomorrow. Well, our first coat's dry, and now it's time to sand. So at this time, we're going to be using either a sanding pole with 150 sandpaper, or you can even go with a sanding sponge, something smaller. But I definitely would recommend the sanding pole. The surface is much more harder, flatter. That way you can sand the flats down to get them as smooth and flat as possible. A sponge might have a little bit too much give to it. But the sponges are definitely good for when you finish sanding angles and stuff like that. So before you sand, I'd recommend also using a particle mask. Make sure you wear this, and if you choose to wear safety glasses, that's entirely up to you, but you really need to have a respirator or a particle mask at this point. All we have to do right now is lightly brush down the flats. After sanding, we take our 10-inch knife and check the flat to see how much fill is going to be left to get this thing totally flat. As you can tell, it's pretty much on its way to being flat. I'd say probably a couple of tight skims and it should be right there. And as we check the butt joint, you can tell it's best to use your knife all the way across the gauge to see how much fill it's going to take, but at this point it's looking very good. So basically 2 more coats and we'll be right there. Well, starting off on this coat, I'm going to coat my angles first. Last time we coated across the flats, across this angle, and you can see the tape right here. So we're going to cap that by coating across it, and then we run our flats. Hopefully this will be dry enough, the angle in a little ways, to be able to pull into it and to run our flats. But first off, we'll coat our angle out. You lay your knife real flat on your final pass. Make sure there's no fat edges. Feather your edges as you go along and make sure this is clean as you go. And then move down the wall. Remember, always pull into the fresh mud. Never a heavy start. Always leave off at the lap mark coming out. That can be sanded off. Pull this coat right into the corner. Now we're ready to coat this side right here. But being my 6-inch knife barely fits inside here, I'm going to switch over to a 4-inch knife. This is where it helps to have a variety of different size knives. Feather your edge. The smaller knives are much easier to maneuver. I like using a 4 or 6 on the angles. On the flats and the butt joints, I like starting off with a 10-inch knife as a first coat, a second coat with a 10, and then a tight skim with a 12-inch knife. Now after clearing this door jamb here, I can switch back to my 6-inch knife. Make sure you don't have your mud too terribly thin, so it doesn't run right off your knife. You want it to be somewhat stiff. I guess you'll just have to find a consistency that you're going to be happy with, that works best for you. So it's basically trial and error. Like I said, the cleaner you keep each coat, the next coat will sand out and coat out much easier. And now we're ready to coat up the flats. So always a good idea to use your 12 or a 10-inch knife to gauge on how much mud you're going to need. If there's a high spot, if there's a high shoulder on the sheetrock itself that you need to split out. It's always good to do that as you go along. Now at this point, since we coated in our angle, which we had to do in order to hide the tape over there, we're going to coat about right here, start this way. This mud right here is set up enough where I could pull into it without messing up my angle. So at this point we're just going to coat right there, we'll cross. Feather your edges. To wipe this edge in right here, just take your knife and press it down harder on one side than the other. And then come across it lightly. That'll allow you to cut in without making a very deliberate and harsh, a heavy start on that one spot. And now we're ready to skim out the butt joint. Make sure you double check, like I said before. It needs to be a gradual hump in the ceiling. You actually don't want to have a hump because it'll cast a shadow from the light once it's painted, and then you'll end up seeing this joint, this butt joint, as a finished product, and that's the last thing you want. So just double check it, run it all the way across. This will paint out or texture out nicely. Okay, we're ready to coat. Our first coat was so successful, I must say that I can almost get away with tight skimming this as it is and have it ready for final sand. But if you have to leave any kind of fill whatsoever of mud, you could end up having air bubbles that might show up after it's sanded, and that would definitely show up through your paint. So, feather your edges. And all we have to do now is put a third coat on our screws. Our second fill coat at this point is done. So what we're going to do now is let this dry. I'm going to put on the final skim coat to cut back a little time, because basically it's the same thing as what I just put on just now. Make sure you check your knife, your flats with your knife to make sure that there's no fills, nothing's crowned out like or a hump, and make sure you sand thoroughly between coats. So tomorrow morning it should be dry enough that we could finish sand. At this point our skim coat is completed. Now we're going to start finish sanding. Always remember, your final coat should always be a skim coat. So at this point we'll be using 220 screen on a sanding pole and a fine, extra fine sanding sponge for into the angles. So also good to remember, it'll be 2 coats of mud in the angles, 4 coats on the screws. On coating the flats, it's 2 coats with a 10-inch knife and 1 tight skim coat with a 12-inch knife. And also when you're finished sanding, make sure you use a halogen light shining across the surface to show up all the imperfections. Finish sanding with sandpaper or the sanding sponge. Wipe down the perimeters with a water sponge. Lays the paper nice and flat. Asbestos sealing is sealed nicely behind sheetrock and mud and tape. And we're at the end of our segment. Thank you very much for watching Drywall Techniques.